Time for the newspaper review, where Alice and I take a look at the stories making headlines around the world. Let's start with the Japan Times. The Ukraine crisis has Japan in a dilemma, it says. The country faces the difficult task of striking a balance between the US, a military ally, and Russia, a vital trade partner.
And in the Financial Times, the FT, the US economy has stalled in the first quarter after one of the coldest winters on record. It says growth came in at 0.1%, well below predictions.
The Wall Street Journal reports on the EU unveiling a stress test for major banks. 124 banks, which account for at least 50% of banking assets in each member state, will be tested on how their investments would hold up in a crisis scenario.
And The Guardian reports pressure on the UK government to safeguard workers with no guaranteed minimum hours of pay. It says zero-hour contracts have tripled since last year.
In the Japan Times again, Donald Sterling, the owner of the American basketball team, the LA Clippers, may be forced to sell his team. It comes after he was banned from the sport after making racist remarks.
And the Daily Telegraph reports on an antibiotic crisis bigger than AIDS. The World Health Organization warns of a growing resistance to modern medicine that could pose a major global threat.
Rolake Akinkugbe is head of energy and natural resources coverage at FBN Capital and is with us now. Good morning. Hello.
Morning. Hi.
The Japan Times is taking a slightly different angle. Of course, it's focused on Japan anyway, of the Ukraine crisis. Explain what it's looking at.
Well, the interesting thing is it's looking at relations between Japan and Ukraine, and indeed, consequently, relations between Japan and Russia. And Japan is in a bit of a geopolitical quandary because on the one hand, it's trying to preserve its alliance with the US. On the other hand, it needs to preserve its relations with Ukraine and Russia. The energy trade here is a big theme because, of course, Japan imports almost 10% of its LNG needs, liquefied natural gas, from Russia. And it also apparently has really close cultural ties with Ukraine as well. So it's quite an interesting dilemma. The other interesting angle is Japan has gone through its own territorial dispute as a sovereign nation. So perhaps it can empathize potentially with the Ukrainians in this regard. So it's a very interesting dynamic here that we haven't seen before.
Of course, yes, it's going through the South China Sea, the islands there with China. But you've got quite a bit of insight.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is quite interesting about this is it reminds us, this particular story, about the relationship between Russia and Japan, which we forget about because we talk so often about Russia and Europe. But of course, the Russian Federation spans from the borders of Europe to the Sea of Japan, from Vladivostok, which is in the Far East. People there look to Tokyo, actually, more than they look to Moscow. I was there for the Medvedev presidential election race in 2008, and it was interesting how people there really do look to Japan. So we forget that there is this very close relationship between Russia and Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be interesting to see how this plays out.
And Japan obviously not going to relinquish that relationship anytime soon. No. Now, the Financial Times, now you've been reporting about the Dow Jones hitting a record, yet the data we're seeing, and quite interesting on the front page of the Financial Times yesterday, was a report that China is going to overtake US as the biggest economy much sooner than thought. Yeah,
is the US's shine, is that disappearing? It's interesting because the first quarter results obviously are only just been published, but the interesting is that the US Fed doesn't seem that bothered in terms of what its own monetary policy stance is going to be. As we know, it's been tapering since late December. So it seems it's still relatively quite bullish about growth in the US. But I'm not sure the forecasts of around I think they were talking about 3% may necessarily materialize this year. But the other interesting is that Obama's affordable care plan seems to have contributed to this increase in consumer spending that we've seen, because obviously these packages and health insurance have obviously been used by a wider section of the population. But the moderating signs are the fall in exports as well as the fall in investment in construction due to the very bad winter that the US had.
Well, indeed, increased healthcare seems to have been the only thing that stopped the economy from shrinking even further.
Absolutely.
And it's just remarkable, isn't it? And this article reminds us just what a big deal the weather is.
It is absolutely a big deal. You can't get your goods out of the country. The other interesting dynamic on exports is what's happening in China, because obviously we know they are important trading partners, the US and China. Growth has slowed down in China, so that could also have been a factor, albeit a minor one.
Now let's look at the front of the Wall Street Journal, because it's talking about these stress tests for major EU banks. It's something that we've been talking about a lot, because we are about to enter a period of supposedly tighter regulation for a lot of banks across the bloc, aren't we?
Yeah, but the question is, we talk about these stress tests coming. Are they going to work? We can't say that yet. And what are they?
Yeah, well, these stress tests are really built for worst-case scenarios. So one of the things that have been pointed out here is, will these banks be able to survive? In the UK, for example, if house prices fell by 35%, as we know, banks are big lenders into the housing market. Will they also survive if interest rates rose? Currently, they're around record low of 0.5%. And as part of this overall EU regulatory intervention, 4 UK banks are involved, HSBC, Barclays. But it also goes to show the wave of regulation, which is the EU wants to prevent another banking and financial crisis. And we know the banking sector essentially underpins the economic strength of several European countries.
Because the article points out, doesn't it, that we've had stress tests in the past, and banks have passed them, but then these banks have then needed equity in the future. So
they've needed to be bailed out. And that is obviously quite a politically sensitive issue. So this is part of overall making sure that this doesn't happen again. But can we safely predict all the possibilities in the future? Time will tell.
Can you imagine when you were sitting there, or when these guys were sitting there, thinking of the worst case scenario, the doom and gloom in the room, just hoping that it would never happen?
Well, given what's been happening lately, some of these worst case scenarios don't look
that far from reality, actually.
Exactly.
Oh, OK. We're going to stick to the gloomy theme, really, because the front page of The Guardian is talking about zero-hour deals. And we've spoken about this before, and I suppose we should just explain, because they're not necessarily a UK phenomenon, are they?
No, they're not. You find them in other countries, but in the UK, within employment contracts, the zero-hour contracts are these sort of on-call arrangements between employers and employees, and employers are not necessarily obliged to provide a minimum number of working hours to employees. And now, last year, the statistics shows that around 583,000 people were on these contracts. Now that number has tripled to 1.4 million. I mean, this is quite staggering when you look at what's happened in the employment market. And it particularly affects young people, those over the ages of 65, I believe. But the other
women.
And women, and the service and some of the really important critical care sectors of the economy are particularly affected by these contracts. It's raised all sorts of labour issues, and also the fact that real wages have actually fallen for many, many young people since 2008. It's quite a serious issue, and I think one which the opposition parties have waded into. Labour in particular is quite keen to see a careful monitoring of this.
So lots of debate as to whether they're a good thing, whether there are any positives to them in terms of flexibility, etc. The Japan Times story that you've been talking about a lot, Naga, of course, the NBA firing Adam... Adam Silver's the NBA.
Sterling.
Donald
Sterling.
Yeah, you don't want to get that wrong, Alice.
No. Well, we all really saw this coming. I mean, this is quite a really serious issue. An owner of one of the most popular basketball teams in the US was basically busted for his racist remarks after a recording was publicized. And now he's being forced and penalized and banned from the NBA for life, $2.5 million fine. And the interesting thing we're hearing now is that Oprah Winfrey could possibly launch a bid alongside other investors for this team.
Makes very clear, doesn't it, that, you know, chief executives, big bosses of big companies, absolutely.
It does matter what you do, figurehead. And I think the NBA will look closely at whether it should have taken a stance earlier, because apparently this is not the first time that he's been embroiled in sort of racist or discriminatory scandals.
Doesn't reflect well at all, does it?
Well, the players made very clear how they felt as well. Let's talk about this antibiotic crisis. Bigger than AIDS. This is on the front page of the Daily Telegraph.
Yeah, this is really scary because, I mean, antibiotics now, the World Health Organization is saying that there's a strain of antibiotics which are becoming resistant to and not able to treat simple and common infections, which, you know, we've all used antibiotics. And you've had drug-resistant antiretroviral viruses. But this is quite phenomenal because the pace of development of science and new drugs that could really break new grounds has slowed somewhat. But these strains of bacteria are actually evolving at a much faster pace than the ability of technology and science to cope. So the question is, how do we go on from here? Common colds simple injuries could actually become life-threatening as a result. So it's an area that really needs to be looked at very critically.
It's interesting because a lot of people resist antibiotics, don't
yeah,
they,
they
as well, to avoid this very problem.
Absolutely.
We're going to finish a little early because this is your last newspaper review with us.
Is.
So tell our viewers, we're gutted that you're going, but tell our viewers where you're going, what you're going to be doing.
Well, I'm relocating back to Nigeria, Africa's largest economy in recent times, to take on a new position in that economy and hopefully contribute to the longer-term development of one of Africa's most important and emerging economies.
It's an exciting economy to be part of.
And it's been a real pleasure.
Rolake, it's been great having you with us here. Good luck in the new job. Hopefully we'll be able to get a camera up there with you and have some views on the latest news. Thanks very much. Rolake Akinkugbe from FNB. Alice and I will see you very soon. Have a good day.
See you soon.